This morning's lesson was done via Zoom, not Twitch, so I cut it to eliminate student voices as much as possible. You'll hear my voice, Trevor's voice, and the youth minister's voice on occasion. Thanks. All right, so for today's lesson, we are talking about Christianity and politics. Stressful. Who's stressed about politics right now? Is anyone stressed about politics right now? Yes. That is why we do this lesson once every 4 years, because once every 4 years, politics stresses us all out. It is, as we like to say, not fun. So today we're going to talk about it. What we're not going to talk about is like who you should vote for or anything like that, right? We're not talking about specific candidates. What we're going to talk about is kind of the idea of Christianity and politics and how things work, I guess, not necessarily in a biblical sense, but like, you know, what does the Bible say about certain things, but also like, how does America work? And how do we use our faith to make decisions and have conversations? But I'm not going to tell you like that means you should vote for X, Y, or Z. Does that make sense? So every time during this year, you know, we have all of these crazy things that suddenly everyone is talking about, and it is very confusing. And there is a lot. You're going to hear lots of words, lots of like buzzwords I'm going to go with, and catchphrases, and you know, it can be very overwhelming. I'm overwhelmed and I'm an adult. I have voted in, how many elections have I been an adult for? Let's see. There was McCain, Obama, I could vote. Obama, Romney, I could vote. Trump, Biden, I could vote. And then, wait, no, Trump, Hillary, and now Trump, Biden. So this is my fourth election I could vote. Presidential, yes, because there's elections in between, right? You guys know that, right? But those are just they're not presidential. The president's every 4 years, and that's when people get really worked up. But we actually vote every 2 years, right?
And sometimes every year locally.
Yeah, it depends. It can be a lot. I was not old enough to vote in the who did Bush run against in his re-election? Kerry, but I was 17. I had friends who were able to vote in that one because that was my senior year in high school. And I lived in Florida in 2000, which was the Hanging Chads election, which was super stressful. Not because the election was stressful, but because suddenly it was all like controversial because Florida had this problem with counting their votes. And I was living there and it was very weird. So during all of this, what you are going to find is when you are an adult and election season happens, a lot of candidates are going to appeal to your Christianness. So I just Googled some headlines real quick to make this chart. I kind of put in like a candidate and like the word Christian, and there were so many headlines. This was only like just a handful that I found. And so you will discover that every candidate, no matter what side they are on, is going to try to get you as a Christian to vote for them because you are a Christian. Does anyone know there have been 45 presidents, right? Donald Trump is president right now. Out of 45 presidents, how many have been Christian? All of them.
Well, publicly.
All of them have claimed to be Christian. Do you know why? To make people vote for them.
And they were all Protestant except
JFK.
JFK is the only guy, and Biden's Catholic too, right?
Yes, Biden is Catholic. And it was a big deal in JFK's election, you guys, that he was Catholic. It was a huge deal. People were making all sorts of things about that. They were like, well, if he's a Catholic, does that mean he's going to do what the Pope says?
Yeah, it'll just be the Pope running the United States.
So every president, everyone running for president, with the exception of Bernie Sanders and a handful of other kind of third-party candidates have claimed to be a Christian. Now, does that mean they are a Christian? Does that mean they aren't a Christian? I don't know. I'm not going to be the one who says, whether they are or not a Christian. That's God's call, right? But they are all going to claim to be a Christian to try to get you to vote for them. And I really thought it was interesting that I found this headline that I kind of have in black here that says, "How would Jesus vote?" So when I was your age, asking the question, what would Jesus do, was like a really big thing. People wore bracelets. They had it on T-shirts. And it is not bad advice in a situation to say to yourself, what would Jesus do in this situation? What is hard about that question is sometimes you have to abstract to get an answer, right? Because Jesus did not face every problem we face. He was not in every situation we're in. If aliens show up tomorrow, there is no answer in the Bible of what would Jesus do that is black and white about aliens, right? Like, that's, last I checked, Jesus didn't get sucked into an episode of The Twilight Zone. So usually what you have to do is read the Bible, kind of understand the context, look at things, look at big picture, and ask yourself, kind of what's the moral decision? What decision would Jesus have wanted us to do? But because it's this abstract question, that means that two people could come to two completely different answers about what would Jesus do based on their reading and their experiences. Trevor and I could come to completely different answers on any of these issues based on what we think Jesus would do. So it's not super straightforward. Every party is going to try to tell you, you should vote for me because that's who Jesus would vote for. And it's like, is that true? Or are you just trying to manipulate me? Good questions. Good questions. So Jesus, as you guys know, was not an American. He was a Jewish man living in Israel, but at the time it was known as Judea, because that is what the Romans called it, because Jesus lived under Roman occupation of Israel. Jesus was not a Roman citizen, so he was basically a second-class citizen in his own. He wasn't even a citizen. He was a second-class person, third class maybe, in his
empire.
And so, when we look at things about like what Jesus said about politics, he actually didn't say very much directly about politics. But there is one section of verses that definitely addresses something political. So we're going to look at that. So if you have a Bible, please flip to Matthew 22. But I'm also going to have the verses up here. Matthew 22, 15 through 22. So while you're flipping there, remember, Jesus lived under the Romans. The Romans, once upon a time, had a republic, but now they were an empire. Jesus was born when Caesar Augustus was emperor of Rome. Caesar Augustus was the first ever emperor of Rome. And the Roman Senate still was still a thing, but it didn't work like our Senate worked. You didn't get to vote for who was your senator. Senators were decided by the people in power, which, one of the emperors put a horse on the Senate. So, these things happened. An actual horse, not like a person pretending to be a horse. No, an actual horse.
It was a really good horse.
So Jesus had no say in how his government operated. He lived in Judea, which was kind of a hotbed of dissension. There were people who supported the idea of the Romans being over them, but most people were not very happy about that because they viewed Rome as their conquerors. So Jesus had no right to vote. He had no say in his government, and he had no ability to control anything. The Romans ruled it, and the Jewish people were just trying to survive it. So one day, Jesus is out and about, and religious leaders of the time ask him a question, a political and religious question. So in Matthew 22, 15 through 22, I'm going to read it. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap him in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, were amazed, and they left him and went away. So these Pharisees, they don't like Jesus, and they're trying to trap him to get him in trouble. The Herodians who are there, they're basically a political party. They're a political party who support Rome. So you have a religious group, the Pharisees, and you have a political group, the Herodians. And they would both kind of want to hear different answers. A lot of religious people at this time wanted to be like, no, you don't pay taxes. We don't owe God not God. We don't owe the emperor anything. He's oppressing us.
The only person we owe God things, not the Romans.
Right. But the Herodians were pro-Rome. And if Jesus said that, if he said something like that, they were going to basically have Jesus arrested or at least marked as a rebel. And you guys remember we've talked about Rome. Rome was scary. When they did end up coming to Israel and like destroying things, they killed 50% of the people. So Rome was not someone you wanted to go against. So they were trying to trap Jesus because whatever he said, they thought they would trap him. If he said, they thought he was going to be like, no, don't pay the emperor. We only owe God. And then they'd be like, ha 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 ha.
Then the Herodians could arrest him for like plotting rebellion.
But then if he said, of course we pay the emperor, if he said it in a certain way, they'd be like, see, you don't love God, right? But instead, Jesus says, in a lot of traditional translations, it says, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Give unto God what is God. So a coin back then looked kind of like our coin, where a person's face was on one side. In fact, our coins are kind of modeled after that because founding fathers were obsessed with Rome. It's a thing. A lot of people during that time period were. He's like, this has Caesar's face on it, so it belongs to Caesar. Now, ultimately we know everything belongs to God, right? But it's Caesar who prints the money, Caesar who hands out the money. So we should pay our taxes to Caesar, but we should also give to God what is God's. And that might include a tithe and our time and our love and all of that kind of stuff. So if there is one political point that Jesus is super clear on, it is that you should pay your taxes. Don't get on the wrong side of the IRS, you guys. Not fun for anybody. But ultimately, I feel like what Jesus is saying is that you should obey the law of the land you're in most of the time. Asterisk. Because, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but give unto God what is God's, right? So if your country tells you you can't go to church, you'd be like, well, I have to give unto God what is God's, right? And then you get, Christians meeting in secret in China or, in Russia during the Soviet Union. But this idea of obeying the law of the land is something that's reiterated in the Bible later. It's reiterated when Paul speaks. Now, Paul was a citizen of Rome. He was Jewish. He was, from the area of Israel. He was from Tarsus. But he had this extra thing where he was a citizen. Now, he didn't get to vote. That didn't mean that. It did mean he get some extra rights. So when we talked about Paul, when things went wrong, he was able to call upon that he should get a trial in front of Caesar.
There were some local things he could vote for, but you don't get to vote for emperor.
No, you don't get to vote for emperor. And they probably wanted to because the emperors were crazy.
Yeah, there were a bunch of positions that you could vote for.
No one got to vote for senator, though. That's not how that worked.
Yeah, it was
weird. Senators are more like a noble house, more like a House of Lords, I would say, than it is like a Senate we have today. And remember, Rome, it's kind of like the Washington, D.C. of the city of Rome is like the Washington, D.C. of the Roman Empire, except it's like if you took Washington, D.C., L.A., New York, and Chicago and put it in one city, because basically no other city mattered, only Rome. Paul was writing a letter to the Romans who lived in Rome, the Roman church, and this is what he said. 13:1-7. 'Romans 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 13:1-7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid. For the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is a servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be subject not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason you also pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servant, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due to them. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. All right. So Paul, subject of the Roman government, he's a citizen, but he doesn't get to vote on lots of things. He gets to vote on some things. And he's saying that you need to obey your government and pay your taxes. This one political point that is clear in the Bible. Once again, pay your taxes, you guys. So what's interesting about this is that Paul is saying this during a time when the church is persecuted. So he's saying pay your taxes, and he's saying be subject to the government. But there is a hidden asterisk to all of this, right? Because he's part of an illegal movement. So obey your government, but I'm part of an illegal movement. Kind of seems like a logical fallacy, right? But Paul is assuming they know what he means. Obey your government unless your government's law goes against God's law, right? We see this all the time in the Old Testament. But before we get to that, Paul, one of the things that I think is interesting about this, Paul and Jesus do not qualify paying your taxes, right? But the government can use your taxes for things you don't believe in. And that was even more true then than it is today. The emperor could have used these taxes to build a temple to Zeus. Obviously, that's not something Paul supports. The emperor did use these taxes to then come conquer Israel and kill 50% of the people. That is certainly not something Paul would support, right? But, Paul was really worried about them incurring extra wrath. He already knew they were a target. And he's like, you guys, we need to keep our heads down and kind of go with the flow. And it's really interesting, and you can kind of have a lot of interesting debates about this, and I hope you do when you're like in high school and college and, have a lot of biblical literacy and historical knowledge. Like, when I was in college, we would debate things like, is the American Revolution biblical? Because if Paul said we're supposed to obey our authorities, that means we couldn't go against the king, right? So there's a lot of fun debates you can have with this. But there is an underlying assumption in all of Paul's words that faith in Jesus and the practices of the church come first before the government. And we see this in Acts. So if we flip to Acts 5:27 through 32, this is one of those stories where Peter and a couple of the apostles have been arrested for preaching about Jesus. So in Acts 5:27 through 32, when they had brought them, they had them stand before the council. The high priest questioned them, saying, "We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name, yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you are determined to bring this man's blood on us." But Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than any human authority. The God of our ancestors raised up Jesus, whom you had killed by hanging on a tree. God exalted him at his right hand as leader and savior, that he might give repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. And we are witness to these things. So is the Holy Spirit, whom God has given to those who obey him." So Peter wasn't obeying his government here. He was doing exactly what his government asked him not to do, which was preach about Jesus. And the reason why he's doing that is because we must obey God rather than man. We obey God first. Boom. So yes, give your tax money to the government. And if they use it against your conscience, so be it on the government. but it is entirely on yourself, the things you personally do, and whether they go against God or not. And there's several Old Testament stories about this, especially during the Babylonian conquering, right? Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to bow to an idol, and they were like, no, we're not doing that. Like, that's the first commandment. Don't have any idols before me, right? And they got thrown in a fiery furnace because of it. Daniel got thrown in a lion's den for something similar later. These people in the Old Testament had no voice, and they did what they could. They knew they had to follow God first. But you might be like, but we do get a voice, right? We live in a democracy. We have constitutionally protected rights to speak. That's the First Amendment. We get to vote. We get to choose our leaders. This is the 21st century. This is not Babylon. This is not Rome, right? So, democracy. We've got a voice. We have a voice, and we get to make decisions, right? Sort of. We're going to talk about that because we don't live in a direct democracy. So in a direct democracy, the people who vote, the people would vote on every single law. The legislative body would be the people.
There's really none of those in the world.
I think ancient Athens tried to have one, but they really limited who got to be a voting citizen.
It was men, and mostly just landed men.
So you had to be wealthy. So direct democracies are hard because could you imagine if you had to make laws in America and all 300 million people had to vote on it? It would be weird. It would be weird. So we live in a republic. You see this in the Pledge of Allegiance, right? It says, and to the republic. We are a republic. What does that mean? That means you vote for the person who represents you. So a bunch of people vote for one person, and that person represents them. So that's like your senator, your representative. You vote for them, and they get to make decisions. I'm going to tell you something that is contradictory. And you need to hold this intention in your mind. There are two things that are simultaneously true. You have the right to vote, and you control your representative, who that person is, in your direct voice. So obviously you don't single-handedly control them. There's a bunch of people who vote. And you should always vote, because that is how you are involved in our government. But you don't get a choice in what the person you voted for does. So you both do and do not control your government. Let's say I voted for Trevor. I really believed in Trevor's policy that everyone should get a dog. This is a great policy. And so I supported him. But then he gets there and not everyone gets a dog. And in fact, he doesn't even fight for everyone to get a dog. That's just something he said for me to vote for him. That happens all the time. There is a song about this in the musical Hamilton, because once again, everything comes back to Hamilton. You guys know this. That's called The Room Where It Happens, right? And here's a couple of lyrics, and they say, no one really knows how the parties get to yes, the pieces that are sacrificed in every game of chess. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. And then they say, we want our leaders to save the day, but we don't get a say in what they trade away. Now, what Aaron Burr is specifically talking about here is the deal that was made by Hamilton and a couple other of the founding fathers about where the capital should be and why they decided on Washington, D.C. That was a concession to the Virginians. But Hamilton wanted to keep the banks in New York. So he traded away the power of where the capital should be from New York or Philadelphia, depending on who you talk to and where they wanted it to be, to Virginia to get what he wanted. And maybe that didn't represent New York's best interest. Maybe that's not what people wanted. But that's what they did to get to the yes, to get to the compromise. Because that's kind of how politics works. We get to vote for somebody, but we don't control them. So you can vote for someone you really believe in, and they can betray your trust. that's just the way things happen. Or maybe you agree with them on like 2 things, but not on 5 other things, right? And maybe they never fought for those 2 things, and they really fought for the things you don't believe in. That's just kind of the reality of how things work. And politicians want to be elected, and a lot of them will say anything to get elected. That's why every president in American history has claimed to be a Christian. Now,
at least half of them
probably
were.
So, and then there's, most of them were probably at least culturally Christian, They're like, I celebrate Christmas and Easter. That's a thing, right?
Like, Jimmy Carter, definitely a Christian. FDR, not 100% sure.
Who knows? I don't know. God knows.
JFK was Catholic, but he
did a lot of questionable things that make me question his morals. So, only Jesus and God know who's actually a Christian. And a lot of times we get so wrapped up in our politics, we think our politicians are going to save us. But can our politicians save us? Only God can save us. Only Jesus can save us. So this means that sometimes your government, your elected government that you had a choice in, goes off the rails. It can do things you don't want it to do. Let's not forget, Hitler was an elected official. Like, these things happen. So what do you do? What do we control? It can feel overwhelming, right? So we're just small people. You're not a politician. And you guys are like middle schoolers. You literally have no voice in what's happening right now, right? You have no control over who gets elected. So what do you do? Well, I always look at Micah 6:8 in situations like this. So in Micah 6:8, the he in here, I believe, is God. So it says, He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. So 3 things that we do personally: do justice, love kindness, walk humbly. How can we do this? How can we do this within our world, right? Well, going back to the extreme example, because this is how politics works, we always go to the most extreme example to help us kind of wrap our head around things. So Nazi Germany, right? It's Godwin's law. In any debate, you get back to Nazi Germany. It happens. So we all know about World War II. We know the Nazis were bad. We know they rounded up Jews and people they didn't like and put them in camps and worked them to death and straight up killed them, right? This is bad. And once again, the Nazis were a political party. They were elected. There were people who supported him, but obviously there were people who didn't. And there were people who were deceived and later came to their senses. But in the end, you reach a point, right, where they are in charge. And you're like, what do? I'm a small person, right? Now, if you're a powerful, privileged person, sure, maybe you can be like Schindler, right? Who, basically hired Jews into his factory to get them to safety. Maybe you can be like Irene Sendler, who saved 2,500 children. Maybe you are one of those brave people who has that ability. But sometimes we're just small people, right? So how do small people play into things? And I have 2 stories that exemplify in Nazi Germany how small people can play into things. One good, one bad. So we're going to start with the not so good one. So there was a girl named Sophie Scholl. She attended the University of Munich in 1943. This was during the heart of the war, right? She was an anti-Nazi activist, and as part of her activism, she was publishing anti-Nazi pamphlets and distributing them at her school. This was against school rules. They were not allowed to distribute pamphlets of any sort. Pro-Nazi, anti-Nazi, doesn't matter. Pamphlets were illegal. I know it seems weird to us because that's like the opposite of how most of our universities work. You walk down a university, you get handed like 12 pamphlets, but that's the way it was. So one day, a janitor, his name was Jacob Schmid, saw her handing out the pamphlets. And Jacob Schmid was an average person. He's a janitor. He had no opinion on her pamphlets. He didn't know the context of her pamphlets. He just knew pamphlets were against the rule. So he told on her. Sophie Scholl was arrested, tried, and killed at the age of 21 for handing out anti-Nazi pamphlets on her campus because a janitor, who is a small man, saw her doing something he thought was wrong. So that's one story. The other story, I had mentioned earlier a woman named Irina Sendler. She was a Polish woman who worked to smuggle thousands of Jewish children. I think in the end it was 2,500 children out. She was a hero who did great work. One day she was on a bus with one of these children. And she's moving the child to a new location via the bus. There's other people on the bus. This is public. I don't know if it's public like our public transportation works, but it was transportation anyone could take, right? And in the middle of the bus ride, the child speaks to her in Yiddish, which is the language of that a lot of Jewish people spoke. And after that happened, everyone on the bus knew. There was like a silence that fell over the bus. And the bus driver pulled over and asked everyone to get off the bus. And when she went to get off the bus, he told her to stay. And Irina Sendler in this moment was like, this is when I die. He's going to take me to the Nazis and turn me in. But that's not what happened. The bus driver turned to her and said, where do you want to go? I will take you anywhere. And so Irina Sendler and this child lived. So these are two small people, a janitor and a bus driver. They were not government workers. They were not, powerful. They are just average people. But they controlled the actions they had in front of them. They had no control over the big picture. They only had control over their immediate area. And in that moment, they asked themselves, what is the right thing to do? And the janitor turned in Sophie and she died. The bus driver took Irina Sendler to a location and she lived. And in those moments, we want to be the bus driver, right? So, in a world where you have no control over the big picture, especially as teenagers who don't get to vote, ask yourselves in the moment, how can you bring justice? Now, America isn't Nazi Germany. I'm not saying it is. Whenever we talk politics, people tend to go to the most extreme example so that you can be like, what would I do in those big stakes situations, right? But we do have injustices here. We have things we don't agree with that we don't get to control. So, we need to look and say, how do we bring love to our friend groups? How do we spread love and justice in our circles to affect what we can? But in the end, you guys are kids. I don't want you to worry. So we're going to look at Matthew 6, 25 through 34. Matthew 6, 25 through 34. This is Jesus talking in the Sermon on the Mount. And he says, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life. What will you eat or what will you drink? Or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food and body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns. And yet our heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? And why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Therefore do not worry, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, and what will we wear? For it is the Gentiles who strive for all these things, and indeed your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But strive first for the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring worries of its own. Today's trouble is enough for today. So, you may be like, Mandy, you just told us about Nazi Germany, and now you're telling us not to worry. Like, surely the people in Nazi Germany needed to worry. Life was worrying, right? Yes, living in Nazi Germany would have been worrying. And Jesus says a lot here about not worrying, about how God takes care of the birds and the lilies, and surely he will take care of us. But you may be like, well, how did he take care of those people in Nazi Germany, Mandy? Back up. Deep breaths, right? So I don't think Jesus is saying here that sometimes the world isn't dark, that sometimes the world isn't bad. Worry is not the same as actual troubles, right? Worry is when you're fretting about things that have not come to pass. If you have an actual trouble before you, that is not worry. That is handling a situation, right? What Jesus is saying here is, I think, verse 34 summarizes it. It says, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring worries of its own. Today's trouble is enough for today. Don't borrow worry. What does that mean? Okay, so when I was a kid, I used to do this thing where you'd have a test coming up and you were worried about the test, which is reasonable. You are studying for the test. You are handling it, right? And you are stressed about the test. But then I'd worry, what if I failed the test? Now I'm going to fail the class. And if I fail the class, well, I have to repeat this year of high school. And if I have to repeat this year in high school, then I'm going to not go to a good college, which means I won't have a job and I'm going to be a hobo on the streets. That is borrowing worry. Do not take worries from the future, things that are not even come to pass, right? Focus on the next thing. Focus on the troubles before you, right? Do not worry about things that haven't come to pass yet, because you don't even know if you failed the test yet. If you failed the test, then you can worry about what that means for this year of high school or the next test or whatever. But don't take it to these extremes, you know? Focus on the thing in front of you. So for you guys, you have no control over the vote. So let it go. You know, control the things in front of you. Handle what is around you. Do love and justice to the people around you. And when you're old enough to vote, vote. That's part of how you put your voice out there. That is one small step we can take, voting for who you're the best candidate. But you can't control their actions. You can only control yours. And remember, politicians will say whatever they need to say to woo you, to bring you to their side. But your faith is not in them. It's in Jesus. Don't ever take anything a politician ever says at face value. That's just reality. Look them up, do your research, look at their records. And remember, we do not belong to a team. You are not a Republican or a Democrat. You are a Christian. You can vote for Republicans or Democrats. You can be associated with a party if you want. That's fine. Register as one or the other. But ultimately, your loyalty is not to either team. Your loyalty is to God. And these are just teams. Despite how people talk a big talk, we are all Americans at the end of the day, right? The Broncos and the Cowboys are all American football teams, right? We are playing the same sport. Republicans and Democrats are playing the same sport. They are American teams. A vote for either is a vote for America. So neither party is God's party. Both parties are human parties, full of human corruption and human failings. And even the parties aren't monoliths. You may support one person and not the other, and they belong to the same party. In fact, that is healthy to, support people based on their values, not the party's values, right? So do your research. So coming back to Micah 6:8, I want to talk about walking humbly. And I want to take this with an emphasis on what does it mean to be mature? Because you guys are middle schoolers, and there's a lot of emphasis on you on being mature, right? Everyone wants you to be more mature. And when it comes to politics, there are some common mistakes that middle schoolers that adults make on what it means to be mature and how you handle your politics. The first is that a lot of adults and middle schoolers alike think that maturity is agreeing with the adults in your life. Now, I'm going to say two things. It is not mature to agree with someone to just agree with them, and it is not mature to disagree with someone to just disagree with them. Just agreeing with your parents because that's what they want is not mature. It'll get you out of trouble sometimes. I'm not saying don't do it all the time, but I'm saying with politics, just agreeing with them because that's their opinion is not mature. Just disagreeing with them because you want to be ornery and anti your parents is not mature.
Don't be an edgelord. Edgelords aren't actually cool.
Yes. The mature thing is to do your own research and have a reason for why you believe what you believe. That's why whenever we talk about things in this class, we talk about a full spectrum of what people believe across Christianity with different things. Because the most mature thing is to understand why you believe what you believe. So listen to the adults in your life because they have wisdom, because they have been through this. They know more than you, but you don't have to agree with them just to agree with them. And don't do what a lot of teenagers do, which is disagree with them to just disagree with them. Come to an opinion, an informed opinion. Know why you believe what you believe. Secondly, it is mature to hold your opinion with humbleness. That means you're keeping space for the fact that you could be wrong. And if you know anything about this election, is that a lot of adults have lost sight of that, of the fact that they could be wrong, that it is possible to have an opinion, even a well-researched opinion and be wrong, right? So, what happens to a lot of teenagers and young people is they think that because I researched my opinion, anyone who doesn't come to the same conclusion as me is an idiot. That is not the way to handle it. As we talked about, because Jesus did not come out and say, I stand here on social justice issues in America in 2020, it can be very hard when two people read the same things. They can extrapolate completely different things. So hold your opinion with humbleness. That doesn't mean you have to change your opinion because the other people has a different opinion. You can be like, I don't believe that, and I think your opinion is incorrect, but I'm not going to scream at you over it. And sometimes it means you just walk away from a conversation. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to leave room for beliefs that are entirely wrong. We all know racism is wrong. And if grandma starts spouting something racist, don't scream at her. Just be like, Grandma, I think you are wrong. And, walk away. All right? Thanksgiving is coming. Be prepared. So it's probably less of a problem with you kids because your grandparents are like, in their 50s and 60s, unlike my grandparents. Politics is a fraught subject. It can be difficult and hard and stressful because so much of it is tied up in what we believe. We want to believe the best in our politicians. We want to believe the ones we voted for are the good ones, but sometimes they're not. And part of maturity is being able to admit when we're wrong, when the person we voted for is not panning out. Right? So it's okay to change your mind. It is not immature to change your mind. That is wisdom. Knowing which beliefs are foundational ones and which ones you're willing to trade on. Wisdom is understanding what you can control and what you can't and acting within that. And most of all, it's remembering that our hope is never in a politician. It's in Jesus. So the world may be dark. You could be living in Nazi Germany one day. I mean, not really, unless you're a time traveler. Are you a time traveler? I don't think so. But do what you can in the world around you. Make good decisions. Yes, God is ultimately sovereign of all, but he lets humans make human decisions and human mistakes. So be the light in the darkness. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly. Love. Don't borrow worry from the future. Focus on today. Tomorrow will figure itself out in time. So that's today's lesson. Do we have feelings? Do we have anxieties? At this point, a student commented that politics stresses them out and they thought it was all stupid. It's very stressful. It can be very stupid. I think part of what we lose sight of a lot of times is that Republicans and Democrats aren't that different. It's kind of like the arguments between Presbyterians and Methodists, right? at the end of the day, we're all Christians. Here, a student commented about ads and how they were tired of all the political ads. There's that I think in Parks and Rec they make fun of this, but there's like that voice they use in negative ads. It's like, Biden, Trump, like, and then they find like the worst picture of the person they could possibly ever find.
And they're always in black and white.
Yes, and then they like red across it like their name, like Joe, Donald.
Yeah, there's definitely marketing strategies that are around all of those ads.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most important things to learn just as like informed Americans is like when people are trying to manipulate you. Right.
So, fun fact, the political ads, especially television ones, have very little effect on the presidential race. They shift things by maybe a couple of percentage points at the most. Now, local elections, name recognition can be a big deal, but everybody in the country already knows who Donald Trump and Joe Biden are.
Look, I didn't watch the debates because I was like, I already know. I went on the internet. I know what these people stand for. I found, what they say about themselves. Why do I need to watch this debate? The debate's just going to make me angry. So, when you become a voting adult, take care of your mental health within it. Do your research. And then if you need to tune it out until the election, tune it out.
Yeah, in a week's time, it'll probably be all over.
Though I do want to prepare you guys that with the COVID and the voting in
the mail-in
ballots, it's probably going to take longer than it normally does. Now, the good thing is that the ads should stop, right? Because after Tuesday, what does an ad do?
No one can vote after Tuesday.
But there's probably still going to be a lot of anxiety in the air from the adults in your life if the election is not resolved by Wednesday. And I'm telling you, it's probably not going to be resolved on Wednesday. The only way it would be resolved on that day is if Florida and Texas come in uncontroversially for the same candidate. I think that's the only way it would be resolved immediately. But let me tell you, as a Florida person, Florida never resolves. Our elections almost always end up 50-50. And then they're like, okay, we have to count these last 5 votes to determine who won.
Or recount. Yeah.
And then there's hanging chads. You don't even know what a hanging chad is. And that's okay. It's like you had to hole punch your votes and the little pieces of paper were still attached.
And they didn't know if it counted or not, if it was still just hanging on, if it wasn't punched cleanly through.
It was a very stressful time. And I didn't vote. I was a middle schooler in that election. So I was very stressed. Here, a student commented on waiting with their mom to vote and how long it took. It took us an hour to vote from beginning to end. So from when we left our car to get back in our car, it was an hour.
So there's some places in the country where people waited in line 4 hours, and then there's a few where people were waiting in line like 8 hours. It's not always super easy to vote. And that's the end of the lesson and the question answer time. After this, we went on to prayer requests, which I don't record. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you can join us next week. Bye.